everybody. My name is Emil Tsenov, and I'm the manager of the European HCM Patient Foundation, which organizes the HCM Pills webcast. Today I'm standing in for Niccolò Maurizi, who is the main anchor of this webcast, but he will take a temporary break because of family obligations. We would like to welcome you to the 12th episode of the HCM Pills, which is a series of webcasts on diverse topics concerning hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We will bring you the best HCM experts to answer the most needed and useful questions directly for patients all over Europe. Remember to comment on the video and ask questions that interest you to help us decide on the topic of future webcasts. The HCM Pills webcast is organized by the European HCM Patient Foundation, a non-profit patient organization aiming to provide help and reliable information for patients diagnosed with HCM all over Europe. I'm here today with Dr. Elena Arbelo, cardiologist at Hospital Clínic de Barcelona and associate professor of Università de Barcelona. Dr. Arbelo is also an executive board member of the European Heart Rhythm Association and member of several committees of the European Society of Cardiology, ESC. She was also the chair of the 2023 ESC guidelines on cardiomyopathies. In other words, she is very active in the implementation of policies which protect patient rights, for which we are all very grateful. So, Elena, let's go to the heart of the problem. My first question is, you are the chair of the last European guidelines on HCM. Can you explain us what the guidelines is and why is it important to have them?
Thank you, Emil, for the invitation to be here, and I'm very happy to share this. The guidelines are documents of major impact in the healthcare community and ultimately for patients and families, because what we do with them is we translate all the studies and all the evidence we have for a particular treatment or diagnosis into easy interpretable guidance so that everybody knows what needs to be done whenever they're facing a particular patient. So it basically aims at eliminating these inequalities that we have in the access to best healthcare. So it shouldn't depend on your postcode or where you live, whether you get, a genetic test or you get a CMR, a cardiac magnetic resonance, or you get a particular device or medication. So this is why the guidelines is important. It's unifying all the evidence so that we recommend the best things to be done and also make sure that they are done safely.
Thank you very much. Is there a legislation in the European Union to look after the rights of patients with genetic heart disease, like HCM? And if yes, what are they and how did we get there?
So yes, there are several regulations and structures that ensure or protect the patients with genetic conditions like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. First is the basic human rights at the European level is that nobody will be discriminated for their genetic background or condition, so that's very important. Second one is the access to EU cross-border healthcare. I think that's very, very, very important, so that guarantees that patients can seek adequate treatment and evaluation outside their own country so that they can access the best level of care. And in that sense, we must underpin the importance of the European rare disease networks like the GARHEART, which is the one that deals with complex and rare diseases of the heart. The GARHEART ensures that a network of centers of expertise in these diseases is accessible to any European citizen. And within that, there's a big patient association representation so that patients have an easy access to the group. There are other initiatives like the European Health Technology Assessment. This is done at a European level so that health technologies and treatments that are brought into the European Union are evaluated. And this is done at the European level so that this can access the different countries. So patients should have access to the best practices. And also the upcoming European Health Data Space. This is coming first for what they call primary use. So if you travel to a different countries, any country will have access to your health data. This is very important for your management, but also it will allow us to have high quality data to perform research, which in these diseases like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is of major importance because there's so many things that we have to still learn and improve.
Absolutely. Just to clarify a bit on that issue, you mentioned that it is not legal to discriminate based on genetic background. So, for example, is it legal for, let's say, insurance companies to require information about the genetic result, the results of genetic tests?
I am aware that in some countries, some people have had, especially in the past, problems based on their genetic testing, and people wouldn't even want to undergo a genetic test for the potential implications with their health and care insurances. At the European level, this was discussed, and again, patients and individuals should not be discriminated for the genetics, so therefore, no, insurances should not adapt or ask for particular genetic conditions and, let's say, treat differently a patient because of their genes.
Clear, but okay, what if it happens? What can a patient do in this case?
It's a complex situation because it's very different among the European countries. So you have countries like Spain, where we have a national healthcare system. Or any patient or an individual is covered by the public healthcare system. This is usually not an issue that we face. You have other countries like the Netherlands or Germany where you have mandated insurances. There, in the past, it used to happen. I'm not aware, but if this is still happening, you should definitely let your national cardiac societies know, because either through the National Cardiac Societies or the European Society of Cardiology, we have access to the bodies at the European Commission level that we can help. You also have the patient associations. That patient associations also are part of EURORDI, so the Rare Disease Association, Patient Association Network, and they also have communication with the Commission. And then you have similar structures at the different, in the different countries. I think that would be a more general approach. And if I were a patient facing that problem, that would be probably the way I'd do it.
Perfect, thanks. This is a very clear reply and a guideline what to do in such situations. Can you explain how new scientific findings are converted to policies in the European Union? And are these policies mandatory? And how is their execution monitored?
So let's start first how we manage in cardiology or in general in medicine. So usually what you have is you have a finding or a hypothesis, you test it in a small group of patients, case series, and then you go to bigger studies. And this is how you create the evidence that makes it then to the guidelines that we talked about before. So these guidelines summarize all of the evidence and grade whether this is a high quality evidence or not to recommend a particular diagnostic or treatment in specific conditions and with specific objectives or for specific purposes. So once this is validated practices that have shown that improve patients' quality of life and outcomes and prognosis, then this is when usually the policy making happens. The regulatory aspect of it usually is independent of the guidelines, but usually it's concomitant and it's a collaborative effort where a new particular drug or a new particular treatment, when coming to the EU, the drug would go to EMA, to the European Medicines Agency. The technologies or medical devices would go through notified bodies, so entities that certify the safety and efficacy of a particular device following a particular pathway. So whenever there's something new it will be evaluated by official, let's say, pathways or entities. And that gives the particular drug or medical device access to the market. Then, ensuring that this is implemented in the different countries will depend on whether there's a particular regulation at the European level or it is a directive. It's a slight different because regulation is something that's mandatory from the European level and every country will need to implement it. Directives are also regulatory tests, but they have to be adapted to every country. And it's the country that needs to ensure that this is implemented at their level. There are European measures to monitor that directives are translated to the different countries, but let's say the responsibilities of implementations are shifted. So how do we participate, or how does this best practices become part of the regulation or directives? There are usually open calls from the European Commission. So when they're discussing bringing up a new regulation, for instance, the medical device regulation that we had some years ago, and now it's undergoing revision and update, there's an open call so that anybody, that includes medical associations, patient associations, notified bodies, industry, anybody can go and provide evidence that this is something that's needed, aspects to be considered. Then the text is reviewed by the European Commission and the particular task force working on that. And then there's again an open call to review the text until it's approved by the politicians, by the parliament, let's say. But the peculiarity is exactly that. So if it's a regulation, it's something mandatory at EU level, directive, same, but it will be translated and done by the national authorities, let's say.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this overview. Really useful to understand what are the differences. And building on that, are there any country specifics in HCM-related policies? If there are any, can you maybe give an example?
So yeah, unfortunately, I think there's quite a wide variation on how rare and complex diseases of the heart are managed in the different countries. Say for instance, in Italy, since 1982, you have mandatory electrocardiography screening before sports participation. Mm-hmm. It's mandatory. I remember I went training there many years ago, and just to go to the gym, I needed to undergo an evaluation, just to see that I didn't have any electrical disorder of the heart. In Spain, we have, since I think it's 2010, the national referral centers for complex procedures and rare diseases and complex diseases. So we have, for instance, the inherited cardiac conditions, national referral centers already audited and recognized since 2010. But this doesn't happen in other countries. And even within a country, so I'm going to give you again the example of Spain, you may have different regions, healthcare regions. So in Spain, for instance, Catalonia has its own healthcare authorities, different from Canary Islands, from Madrid. And in Catalonia, for instance, we've implemented the mandatory electrocardiographic evaluation of children at the age of 10. Mm-hmm. So we would be able to detect electrocardiographic manifestations of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, for instance, at that age.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see the development of HCM legislation in the next, say, 10 years? Do you think that there are any gaps to be filled in? Or?
Well, we're entering very exciting times, I think. So last December, the European Commissioner announced that there would be a European cardiovascular health plan. And this is actually in the making at the moment. Last August, so August 11th this year, there was an open call for evidence. So any person, any association, including patients, citizens, patient association, medical associations, pharma industry, could give their own personal perspective regarding on what this cardiovascular health plan should have. And I think we have a major opportunity here, because we know that traditionally we have been seeing cardiovascular disease as something that is due of unhealthy life choices. No, you don't exercise, you smoke, you don't eat a healthy diet, and that's why you have heart disease. But this is in fact wrong half of the time. So it's been shown that at least 50% of cardiovascular disease cannot be explained by unhealthy life choices. And this means that diseases like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where you have genetics and you have other factors influencing, and it's usually even healthy people, will have the opportunity to access high quality research, high quality organization of healthcare. So the prior Beating Cancer plan organized management of cancer around the cancer clinics. So this is where we have the opportunity now. Now with this new upcoming cardiovascular health plan, we can organize and ensure that patients have access to expert centers that are multidisciplinary, that have all the diagnostic and state-of-the-art treatments. You know that in these diseases, you need to integrate the information of genetics, of imaging, of the family. And then you also have to predict risk of sudden cardiac death. And all of that, beyond needing a lot of expertise, you also need research. And for that, the cardiovascular health plan, the European health data space, is going to be a great opportunity.
Yeah, you already partially answered to that question, but I would still like to ask you if there is a mechanism to include patients in the legislation process for that. And for example, how can patient organizations participate in this process? For example, how can our organization be part in this process and help you?
So I think this is a very relevant question, because ultimately we're all working towards the same goal, or I hope we're all working towards the same goal, which is to improve people's health. And that means if you can prevent disease, and if you have a disease, prevent complications and ensuring that people can lead healthy and happy lifestyles, okay? So when you're trying to do this, I think it's very important that we all work together, patient associations, healthcare professionals, regulators, of course, and then people that are developing all the innovation. So we really need to work together. There are several areas or points where you can work, and you can do it at a regional level, you can do it at a national level, you can do it at a European level. And I'm going to give you the example of several examples that I am experiencing, let's say. I'm advising for the Rare Disease Network, Personalized Medicine, Cardiovascular, so several working groups in the Catalonian healthcare department. So in the past, what used to happen is that doctors would sit with regulators, they would come up with, you know, what they thought was the best organization of care, and then there was an open call for patient associations, which was good, but it was very late in the process. We've changed the way we're doing this. So now patient association representatives are sitting from the beginning in the task force. So they're part of the expert group of the cardiovascular health plan. I am leading the sudden cardiac death prevention and improving outcomes in sudden cardiac arrest, and they're sitting with us from the beginning. And this is at the Catalonian level, but this happens also with the ministry. And say, for instance, I'm at the European Commission collaborating, I'm also advising with the medical device regulation working group, which is called the coordination group. And there are task forces for orphan devices, for breakthrough devices, and for all that, patients do have access to provide their feedback, and they're consulted throughout the process. And in fact, the Rare Disease Network, the GARD-HART, has a partnered patient association group. So it's the EPAC, which is encompassing all of the European patient associations dealing with rare and complex cardiovascular diseases, working together alongside with healthcare professionals to improve management of these conditions.
This sounds very encouraging. Just out of curiosity, are there any major differences between the HCM legislation in the European Union and, say, United States, UK, China, Japan?
So we can look at this from two perspectives. If we look from the clinical perspective, you know that healthcare professionals usually work through the international practice guidelines, let's say. So for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, you have two. There's, on the European side, we published the 2023 cardiomyopathy guideline. And then you have in the US one specific published in 2024. So that would probably influence how the healthcare professionals manage hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. If you're looking from a regulatory perspective, the process is slightly different. There's usually not so much intervention on how a particular doctor prescribes one test or one drug, beyond the fact that any new drug or any new medical device will need to be evaluated by the authorities. And here you do have some differences. So the common goal is to ensure that medical devices and drugs are safe and provide benefit. So the way the US does it, for instance, is through the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So it's a centralized agency with specific guidance to approve drugs and medical devices. In Europe, we have the European Medical Agency. So that's a centralized agency for drugs, but medical devices are evaluated through third parties, which are the notified bodies, which are experts in auditing these medical devices to ensure that they are safe and they have shown specific evidence described by a particular regulation, so that whenever they give the approval, you ensure a particular or a certain degree of quality. And then you also, through regulatory, regulations and directives, you also ensure and make sure that there's some post-market surveillance. So you see that what you bring into the market is actually safe and it's bringing benefit to the population. But so ultimately, the goal is the same, but how we do it is slightly different. And if you look, for instance, to innovation or orphan devices or drugs, it's managed differently. So there's an expedited pathway in the FDA, and this is evaluated in a centralized way. When you look for medical devices, when we developed the guidance, I was part of that task force at the European level. So this guidance is helping manufacturers to understand whether they can ask for an extended protection period, let's say. And so it's slightly differences, but the ultimate goal is to have safe devices and hopefully help them come to the market as soon as possible, also for patients.
Great. And coming back to your reply to the last question, is there any special procedure for the approval of treatments for rare diseases like HCM in the European Union? That's my final question.
Yeah, so there are special pathways for orphan drugs and orphan medical devices. And basically, the criteria for that is that they treat severe or complex conditions for which there are not available optimal treatments. And for that, the requirements of evidence are not going to be as strict as for a very prevalent or a very frequent disease, because if you talk about hypertension, it's very easy to conduct major studies So the requirements are stricter, but if you have a rare disease, a rare condition, maybe to be able to generate that evidence, you need to bring it to the market. And so ensuring that there's an appropriate minimal clinical evaluation, and that once you bring it to the market, you ensure that it's monitored properly so you detect if there's any problem. There's specific pathways where these drugs and these medications can go so that the patient ultimately can get it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much for your valuable time and your great responses, Elena. Thanks also to our sponsors for making this webcast possible. We hope that this brief discussion with Dr. Arbelo was useful to better understand the disease and yourself. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment to help us get the word around and decide the next important topics of next webcasts. See you soon.